So to wrap up our color unit, we're going to come back to this idea of working with color as value, not necessarily color as color, like I'm going to paint a red fire engine red, but thinking about the sort of darkness and lightness of those tones. Take a second and sort of page back through your sketchbooks and consider all the different drawing approaches we've taken, drawings from life, drawings with templates, drawings with perspective, nested objects, freehand drawing objects, sort of cuts, transparencies. I want you to sort of think about something that you think about a drawing exercise you really liked, and bring one of those drawings to that final piece of paper that we've been working with. The watercolor paper, the wet media paper, and you're going to actually work up one of your drawings in watercolor. So one idea I had, right, was to sort of continue working with some of these nested objects. These are versions that I drew with a template that I could work with. I could also attempt to work with a drawing from life. I started thinking about possibly working with eggshells, right? Eggshells against a white background. I'm not going to do that for this demonstration, but I can challenge one of you guys to approach that one maybe. I think I'll do two demonstrations. I'll work with one with these templates here because they're fairly basic. Just a couple of shapes to fill in, and then I'll freehand a similar one down here and do something slightly different. So a couple things to consider would be, what are going to be the colors that we work with? I think I'm going to keep my palette fairly limited. I'm going to work with my blues in terms of its the value gradation, so the lightness and darkness of blue. I'm only going to throw in one twist here, and that's I'm going to work with a ground. In other words, I'm not just going to paint my object, but I'm going to be painting the area around my object. Similar to how when we did our life drawings, we focused not just on shading the objects, but shading around the objects as well. And for that ground, or sort of the surface that my objects are going to be transposed against, or sort of staged against, I'm not going to use a blue. I'm going to step outside of the monochromatic values and add a complementary background, a sort of a mixed down or desaturated complement. So to do that, I'm going to have to go over to the color wheel and ask, what are the complements to blue? Well, that will put me into the orange family, so I'll be working with desaturated oranges, and I'll do a little bit of a demonstration with that here in a second. I think what I'll do is I'll start with my background here and follow the same sort of basic ideas that we would use if we were making objects, fabricating objects in the studio. Work big to small. The background is a big thing, so I'll lay the background in first, and then I'll gradually work in more and more and more detail, and then eventually just be doing the smallest little bits. If you use this technique, I recommend that you just make sure that you allow the Sharpie marker or your ink to dry before you bring watercolor to it. It shouldn't bleed, but just in case the ink is still really wet, you'll end up with ink and paints blending. A similar thing may happen when I do my graphite demonstration here, but that's actually something that you could work with too. Another thing to consider would be, if you're going to work with transparencies, how do transparencies make themselves appear? Generally, if we're looking through a material, it obscures the subject a little bit, so consider that, how you might kind of use semi-opaque colors, or maybe some of my lines stay in, but some are blacked in heavily with the marker, and some are only lightly suggested with the graphite. Since my objects here are going to be rendered in blues, I think what I'll do is I'll start with the ground, the background, and work with a desaturated orange. In order to get ready for this painting, I've got my palette again, I have a piece of tissue paper, I have my watercolor brush, and a bit of water here. Again, I'm going to say that if you happen to have a watercolor brush, a larger one of these mops, it may be sort of handy to do some large-scale background work. I'll do one as an example on my second drawing here, but I'll do my first drawing entirely with my detail brush here. So I'll start by bringing some water to my palette. And I'll start with my orange color here, and I'm going to start pulling in orange, and it looks like the color that was in my palette is already just a little bit muddy. Muddy is another way of saying desaturated. In order to get colors to desaturate or sort of move toward a grayed down version, you add their complement. The complement to orange is blue, and so I'll go ahead and grab some blue from the palette and sort of lay it down next to the orange, and I'll bring those together on my palette. And you'll notice that when you start to mix those complements, they gray down immediately, and then you can add as much or little water as you want. What I'm going to do is, now that I've got the colors that I'm looking for here, this kind of grayed down orange, I'm going to pre-wet the background of my piece. By pre-wetting it, it'll be a little bit friendlier towards accepting color, and if I make a mistake because it's already pre-wet on the page, I'll be able to lift some of that out. So essentially I'm just painting in water now, and I'm filling in a little area around the piece. This technique is called working wet into wet, and then now I'll bring my color to the areas that I've already pre-wet on the page. This has the effect of just sort of giving a little bit more of an airy, or sort of a very light blended feel for these backgrounds. These colors are not going to have very sharp edges at all. The wet into wet technique sort of really blends colors, and they just kind of fade away. Really good for backgrounds and things like that. Backgrounds and transparencies. That wet into wet technique. So something to consider here is if you're making paintings of objects that are sitting flat on the ground, you would want them to have somewhat of a shadow underneath. But this is sort of like pre-shadow. I'm not even quite at that point yet where I'd be considering a shadow. At this point, I'm really just laying in a sort of very loose background color. I'm sort of knocking down the white, glowing white paper of the background. Backgrounds should always recede and push back, and one way that you can do that is to mix them as neutrals or sort of muted colors. Now I'll choose sort of the next larger area, some of these shell areas, and I'm going to go with a much more vibrant blue. And similar to when we did our values here, I'm going to go with first a blue that's fairly light. That way I won't accidentally goof. Now I'm going to go. Now I'm going to paint wet into dry. This way I'll have a little bit more control over my edges. Now the colors will probably end up bleeding quite a bit on these. Don't get too caught up in the idea that, we're supposed to have really perfectly clean edges. And I'm not sure if the video is going to pick this up really, really well, but I've already kind of bled one of my lines here. Don't really fuss about trying to get those perfect. If I had waited to fill in that blue, it probably wouldn't have been so likely to bleed like that. But I'm working pretty fast here, so I'm not so concerned. Generally what ends up happening is that'll dry down and sort of blend on its own. If I was really feeling concerned, I may come back in on the outside edge and lay in some more of that neutral orange, just to sort of pull that back, the sort of blue blending that happened right at the edges of the circle. Because I noticed that those blended so quickly, before I do my sort of inside shadows, I'll probably just wait to do those. I'd rather have a little bit more tight control over that before I go inside. Now, because this is a spherical object, I'm going to give it just a little bit of value here. I'm going to lay in some darker values on the underside of this lower shell. I'll let the watercolor itself sort of do some of that blending. Let's put the color down and let that sort of fade into the piece. And finally, for that inside color, I'm going to use yet another sort of blended version here. I'm going to go with sort of a desaturated yellow, another color that is in a relationship to the color blue, because I have a little bit of orange in my brush still. That yellow got knocked down just a little bit. That's good. And I'll sort of have this revealed form inside, being a little bit stronger color. Maybe even let some of the whites of the paper sort of show through at those outer edges. Think about what you learned as you were working with some of your drawings from life, and how certain values sort of appeared, how some colors sort of looked a bit darker in some areas, sort of as shadows appear, right? I'm going to add just a little bit of orange to this yellow, right as it's sort of under on the inside of the of that top shell. Orange is a way of kind of making that yellow feel a bit darker. Instead of adding black to colors, sometimes I like to just add their slightly darker analogous color, and that makes it feel just a bit darker without having to get so muddy. Okay, so because that's pretty wet at this point, I'm going to let that one be for a minute. I know I still have to do a little bit of value work in there, but it's not off to a bad start. I'm going to do one more sort of experiment down here and work with a slightly larger brush, a little bit freer and faster. Okay, so I suppose I probably could have maybe used a template to clean up some of these lines, but eventually I sort of like my drawings to get freed up a little bit from the sort of crutches of always needing to use things like that. So I'm using my pencil lines here to sort of give me a quick guide of where eventually my brushwork will be. I'm going to use a lot of my pencil lines just sort of in the drawing itself, and I'm also going to come in with a sort of a mop brush here, and I'll just work with the same color palette here, but invert it. I'll start by using neutralized blue in the background, kind of a gray blue, and I'll put a little bit darker background down on this piece here. So you notice that when I mix blue with orange, it becomes nice and gray. Sort of love that little trick. And so I'm going to work right up next to the edge of all of my forms here with a big mop brush. And this brush is really just kind of laying down some fast color. One of the nice things about watercolor is that it's really fast, really cheap. The material's kind of easy to come by, and And man, can really describe forms very quickly once you kind of get the hang of the way the brush behaves. Okay, so I've got my ground laid in, a couple of little notches where this form will play. And I think I'll continue to use this larger brush to lay in my basic oranges. So I'm going to do an inside-outside here. I'll do an inside orange. I should say I'll do my sort of outsides of my form here in orange. And then the insides I'll do in blue. I'm working wet onto dry here, and that keeps my line work a little bit tighter. It doesn't kind of blend quite so quickly. So those colors go down sort of quickly and almost sort of in a messy way with that big brush. Now I can come in with this small brush and maybe do some more of my detail work. Like if I was hoping to do some blue, a little bit more of a vibrant blue as the sort of inside colors, I'll have a little bit more control over what that brush is doing on the inside, just as if I had a nice sharp pencil. Got a little bleeding there. It's okay. I'll just kind of brush and mix that in with the orange and come back in and visit that again with some more blue. If I really wanted to avoid the bleeding at all costs, I would just wait for my first round of color to dry. But I'm working pretty fast for this demonstration. Okay, so now I've got sort of my ground laid in, my outside and my inside forms. That's the big stuff, right? Then I might come in and, once this is dried up a little bit, come in and describe some more of those detail areas, like on the bottom side of this sphere here. Some detail work would be like being a little bit more deliberate about laying in some darker blues on the underside of this sphere. Maybe being a little bit more deliberate about kind of eliminating some of those bleeding areas. The underside of this sphere should feel darker than the top side of the sphere. If I goof, don't forget, you can always bring in your paper towel and sort of lift off some of those colors and go ahead and just blend that right back in. If watercolor still feels sort of complicated for you and sort of uncontrolled, a great way to sort of like pick that up and just run with it would be to work on multiples, right? Don't limit yourself to just working on one final one as though it's like the perfect. Making mistakes on a few different pieces all at the same time sort of relaxes some of the stress of working with these colors, especially if they don't feel like they're very controllable. And I guess worst case scenario, just grab a piece of tissue paper and just practice with it. Just grab it and see if it'll lift off the page. You might be surprised at what you find. So now I'm going to work up a neutral, blue-orange, and actually at this point bring in just a touch of black to darken that up. and this is the color that I'll lay in as the inside values. If the original maxim is work big to small, this now is working fairly small. Got a little bit of bleeding over the edge, but what can you do? Just lift that out. Okay, that's not bad. I may give a similar sort of bottom side to this orange here. Give my sort of conical sections a dark value on the bottom side to describe the form a little bit better. And then maybe an inside edge to this blue ring. Now I'm just painting with water again on the background, just to sort of pull in some of this darker shading. So all that to say, what I'm hoping to see you guys practice a little bit here is in our final attempt to sort of work with drawing is see what you can do to use color to render in the three-dimensional object feel. We're using color here not necessarily to describe the color of our objects, as though I was trying to accurately draw the sort of orangey brown of this egg, so much as I'm describing lights and darks, and I'm working within color groups like analogous and complementary colors.